Welcome to the podcast, Jillian.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Same. So I always love to start the podcast with a new guest with the origin story. So I'd love for you to share your origin story and how you got into the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. I feel like everyone in this space has an origin story and, kind of personal and professional experiences that led them to do what they do now. For me, in terms of becoming, functional medicine dietitian, specializing in women's health, it was really a combination of personal health struggles combined with professional experience as well. To give you a short version of a very, very long story, I about a decade ago started experiencing a lot of health issues, health symptoms that felt like they were popping up out of the blue: eczema, anxiety, acne, bloating, head hair loss. And at the time, I was in grad school, studying nutrition. I worked in nutrition research. I had an undergraduate degree in nutrition and felt like I was doing all the things that were textbook healthy. But I started to experience a lot of these symptoms. At the time, I had also been on hormonal birth control for a little over 10 years that I was put on at a really young age for heavy periods. And I started to first seek out support from conventional providers and was really left without answers. They ran lab work and said, "Hey, you're the picture of health. Everything looks great," despite, all these symptoms I was experiencing. And I was basically only offered Band-Aid solutions. So, use a topical steroid for the eczema, try this topical or medication for the acne. And, I was just tossed around from one provider to the next, and no one was willing to dig deeper with me, and no one was kind of asking the question why. And I really wasn't willing to accept that these symptoms were happening for no reason. I had also tried to get support with learning more about the hormonal birth control that I had just taken and, in all honesty, had not questioned for, 10 plus years. And because I could not get support from my providers, I started to dive deeper into research on hormonal birth control, really learning about female physiology, which I learned nothing about in my training. And, eventually I also found the world of functional medicine, integrated functional medicine. And it was like, an aha moment, or the light bulbs went off, where, this deeper root cause approach was actually looking to assess, why are these symptoms happening in the first place? So that led me to, seek out advanced training in functional medicine and, to run testing on myself, to really start to take a serious look at my diet, my lifestyle, how things were, supporting or not supporting me. At the time, I was, running half marathons, HIIT training 5 days a week, eating predominantly a plant-based diet. So I had a lot of changes to make. I also took myself off of, hormonal birth control, which led to all of my symptoms, getting worse. I had long cycles, heavy, painful periods. But over time, through deeper testing and, with really targeted nutrition and lifestyle strategies, I was able to heal these symptoms naturally and really to get my body back to balance and to do that without the Band-Aid approaches. I always like to be honest about the fact that, getting to that point of actual symptom resolution and having a lot of resilience in my body took a lot longer in my mind than it should have. And certainly healing takes time. However, I was hacking a lot together on my own. And in talking with friends and family and colleagues, I realized, like, wow, so many women out here are struggling with, being offered birth control is the only option for, every women's health symptom under the sun. And it really motivated me to start my private practice after, becoming a registered dietitian, and to, really change the trajectory of my career in terms of wanting to provide women with the support that I so deeply wished I had had when I was kind of in the trenches and struggling.
We share a lot in common. As a matter of fact, I've had like 12 years of on and off, like really irregular periods. And it also caused circadian rhythm dysfunction because, there's a relationship between the two. Anxiety, which, a lot of times we attribute it as a completely separate thing, but years of really not having answers and getting so frustrated and intuitively knowing there's got to be something deeper than this, than what I'm being given. And then of course, going through this state where you almost lose hope. You think, okay, that's just the way my body is. It's just off. But
Yeah.
you don't realize. And then also kind of something that came to my mind as you were saying, how you got off the birth control pill. When you got off the birth control pill, you had more symptoms come up again. And sometimes actually, the healing process can be a very frustrating one because you almost have to go through really difficult times and be patient, knowing that your body's still moving in the right direction, but you almost have to go through those difficult months, or maybe even sometimes close to a year to really regulate, even when you are healing yourself.
So such a good point. And healing journeys are never linear. And, coming off of hormonal birth control after 10 plus years of hormonal suppression, naturally that's going to be a big transition, a big change for the body, and things aren't going to bounce back perfectly normal. And I think the hardest part in my journey and what I see with a lot of women is that they're in the trenches, they're struggling, they're trying different strategies and approaches, they're self-researching, and they often don't have support to guide them in terms of, okay, the symptoms you're experiencing or the response you're experiencing, like, this is normal and we need to stick with it and give the body time. Women are just guessing, right? And they're frustrated and they can't find that support. So I think, a key thing for me was really wanting to be able to guide women on that journey. And, because I think when I did come off hormonal birth control and things went really haywire, not having anywhere to turn and just the stress that adds is a lot.
Yeah, and also not having anybody give you answers, or at least like some signposts like, oh, it's going to be fine eventually if you do X, Y, and Z,
Right,
but
right.
completely like in the dark. And it is it's so frustrating. And I see a lot of my patients coming in. So many people go on the birth control pill for years on end, like years with no breaks. I actually was on them too, and that was pretty much the solution I was given. But for some reason, I was just inconsistent. I was kind of like intuitively knew to take breaks.
Yeah.
But I could have just kept going if I just listened to what they said, like, and just kind of like nonstop. And a lot of people do. So I actually want to talk about that because I want to talk about because there's so many people listening, I'm sure, have been in the same boat. And what does the hormonal birth control do to your body? Like, what impact does it have? I know like how it, from my perspective and my lens, but also I know that it really impacts gut health, gut microbiome. It makes you deficient in a lot of vitamins and nutrients. So I'd love to get your take and kind of break down for people listening to understand really the processes of the body and how that aspect of it gets shut down.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because so many women are put on hormonal birth control without that informed consent in terms of like truly understanding the mechanism of action or like how the birth control is working. What are the potential side effects? And I always like to say to clients that, we are never anti-birth control if that's a tool that feels really supportive for you. However, I do have a beef with the lack of informed consent and women kind of getting all that information to make, empowered, informed decisions. So hormonal birth control, in terms of how it works, it will vary depending on the type, right? Are we on an oral contraceptive, or, do we have an IUD? But in terms of speaking to the oral contraceptive, specifically the combined oral contraceptive being kind of the most common form of birth control, this type of birth control is essentially going to shut down our reproductive system. So it is shutting your own hormones off.
Mhm.
So we are not, producing our own estrogen. We're not ovulating, producing progesterone. I think that's so important to point out because so many women that get a monthly withdrawal bleed when they're on their placebo week, are not aware that they are not actually ovulating or cycling. So it's
Right.
important to know that, again, this is a withdrawal bleed where we're, kind of shedding or sloughing off, the uterine lining where we get this, withdrawal bleed, but we're not actually bleeding in the true sense of a period where ovulation has occurred. So first and foremost, communication between the brain and the ovaries is shut down. So hormones are suppressed. Um, in terms of potential, side effects with hormonal birth control, you hit on some of the big ones. Nutrient deficiencies really common. So, B vitamins, magnesium, vitamin C, selenium, zinc, all are depleted by hormonal birth control. And, these can be kind of subclinical, but again, if we're on hormonal birth control for 5, 10, 15 years,
Mhm.
these things can really accumulate. And some of the nutrients that I'm mentioning that get depleted by hormonal birth control are also key nutrients that are involved with hormone production,
Mhm.
hormone breakdown and clearance. So that's a big one. Other kind of side effects of the birth control pill definitely impacts to gut health. So possibly negative shifts or implications for our gut ecosystem. Our healthy gut microbes. There's also evidence indicating possibly increased intestinal permeability, meaning the gut lining that we want to be really strong and healthy can become less healthy and essentially more permeable. Which can, drive inflammation in the gut and also systemically. So we see those impacts on gut health. There's also impacts on cortisol in the adrenals, and there's also impacts on the liver, a heavy burden on the liver, which plays a key role in processing our hormones as well. So those are kind of some of the big things I think about with hormonal birth control. And ultimately, too, I'm sure you find this as well with clients where oftentimes women are on birth control for a long time. They come off when they want to get pregnant and, thinking like, oh, I'm going to come off, my cycle will be regular and I'm going to get pregnant. And,
Yeah.
for some women, that may be the case. Great. For the women we work with, that's often not the case where they come
Yep.
off hormonal birth control and their period doesn't come back, or it's
Yep.
very irregular,
Yeah.
hormones are imbalanced, or they experience a whole slew of new symptoms that were kind of being suppressed by the hormonal birth control.
Yes, I see that very often. It's interesting because I had a teacher when I was going to school for Chinese medicine, and one of the teachers, her specialty was gynecology. And it was kind of interesting how she put it. She said, basically, your ovaries get lazy. It's almost like when you put a cast on. Like, what happens to the muscle? You could literally take two legs, one with that had a cast, or arms, and you can see it becomes almost like it looks emaciated, like
Mm-hmm.
it's like skin and bones because the muscle's not being used. The body works like that. If you don't use it, you lose it. It's just like that. That's how the
Mm-hmm.
body works. So it impacts that aspect of the body because it knows, oh, it's shut down. I don't need to work on this. This is
Mm-hmm.
something that I can put on the back burner. So it's pretty fascinating stuff. And again, like you said, in many cases you might need it and that's okay, but at least you know, or you can prepare for it so you know what you're signing up for. And if you are, you might want to like take breaks or, consider different ways of taking it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we always tell women too, if you're on birth control and you want to remain on it, then there's so much you can do to, support your body with mitigating, some of those side effects. Or if you're on birth control currently and you're thinking you want to make a transition off in 6 months or a year, amazing. That's an opportunity for us to really support things to ideally, prepare the body for a more easeful transition when the time, feels right for you. A couple other things I actually want to mention about hormonal birth control that I also think is, not talked about enough is the fact that, the oral contraceptive is associated with increased insulin resistance, so more blood sugar issues, and also with increased levels of inflammation, as evidenced by biomarkers like our CRP being elevated with women on hormonal birth control. So I just think it's important to kind of have all of that information.
And speaking of blood sugar, I know that, I mean, we know that in PCOS, cases like PCOS, but even otherwise, like it can really impact fertility. And so I would love for you to talk about it because I know you work a lot with this.
Yeah. So, I always say to clients that balancing blood sugar regulation is step number one if you want to balance your hormones. And blood sugar regulation is incredibly important when it comes to fertility. So, ultimately, when we're talking about, blood sugar balance, essentially we're referring to, when we eat food, and food that we eat is broken down into sugar or glucose, and our glucose goes up, right? Ideally, after we eat throughout the day, we want to experience kind of like slow rolling hills with our blood sugar. So slow rises and slow declines throughout the day. What we ideally want to avoid are the big peaks and valleys, or the big spikes and crashes with blood sugar where we're getting, highs and lows. Highs with blood sugar, where we're getting big rapid spikes and blood sugars remaining elevated for too long, this can contribute to inflammation. So when we have high blood sugar spikes, the body has to pump out a lot of the hormone insulin in order
Mhm.
to, usher that glucose into our cells. And, high insulin chronically, again, is going to drive that inflammation, which can be, damaging for egg quality in a big way. And we also know that excess insulin can drive the ovaries to overproduce hormones like androgen hormones.
Mhm.
And this can even interfere with ovulation and the regularity of, ovulation, as, well as other symptoms. What's also, I think, not talked about enough is blood sugar lows or blood sugar crashes, right? So we talk a lot about, avoiding blood sugar spikes, but in my mind, blood sugar lows or blood sugar crashes are just as detrimental to the body as these blood sugar highs in a chronic sense.
Mhm.
When blood sugar gets too low, this kind of sets off the alarms in the body, where the body senses, energy resources are scarce. So it starts to pump out hormones like cortisol, one of our primary stress hormones. And cortisol will, tap into glucose stores in our liver and our muscle and kind of dump that into the bloodstream to try to normalize things. So essentially, low blood sugar is inducing a stress response.
Mhm. So
And
we're
we
thinking intermittent fasting.
Yes, we're thinking intermittent fasting, ultra low carb diets, or, carbohydrate intake that is inappropriate to, sort of meet an individual's needs. So definitely the intermittent fasting, and, just going too long between meals. I'm sure a lot of listeners can relate to the feeling of low blood sugar, which can actually present a lot like anxiety, right? We might, experience rapid heart rate, or we might feel jittery. We might feel, moody, irritable,
Hangry.
hangry, exactly, hangry. And, these are all symptoms of low blood sugar or sugar crash, and that stress response that follows. And when it comes to hormonal balance, when it comes to supporting and optimizing fertility and egg quality, really the number one goal is to prioritize safety in the body,
Mm,
right? A sense of
yes.
safety from every angle. So, making sure that blood sugar is really balanced and stable is an incredible way to promote and prioritize that safety in the body.
Mhm.
And it's such a huge foundation that I find is often overlooked. We also do have data that's found that women who have blood sugar levels that are considered, within normal parameters in terms of like their fasting glucose and their hemoglobin A1C, which are some, typical markers of, blood sugar health that your doctor might run. Women that have normal blood sugar parameters, but that experience dysglycemia, meaning we're getting, highs and lows with blood sugar, even though our labs look normal. Um, these women actually have, are less likely to conceive on any given cycle. Also, ovulation rates are more disrupted in women, again, that have normal blood sugar parameters, but are still experiencing, wonkiness with their blood sugar that is likely creating stress in their body.
It's so interesting. And so what is the cause if they see that everything looks normal in the labs and they're still spiking, what condition is that? What is causing that?
Yeah. So, ultimately, I think it speaks to the fact that like in our in our conventional system, when it comes to like labs, using blood sugar labs as an example, first and foremost, normal reference ranges are very large, right?
Mhm.
So what's considered normal is not actually always optimal. So these reference ranges are wide, where we could be on sort of the far end of the scale, which could indicate early stages of some issues. But because we don't fit into kind of the perfect box of a medical diagnosis of having prediabetes or diabetes, we kind of get fall through the cracks essentially. But I think what's important to point out is that you may not have prediabetes, or you may not have insulin resistance or issues with your cellular insulin sensitivity, but you can still be riding the blood sugar roller coaster, and you can experience big swings with blood sugar from under eating, fasting, or erratic meal timing, from stress, over exercising and under fueling, disrupted sleep. So this can contribute to blood sugar wonkiness that may not be reflected in significant abnormalities in our labs, but these ups and downs with blood sugar can absolutely impact our hormones and our fertility.
That's fascinating because a lot of times you hear about blood sugar, you're thinking just diet, but you're mentioning all of these other aspects of them, which really prepare the body to handle it. It sounds
Yes.
like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And nutrition is so foundational for balancing blood sugar. But you could have the most perfect diet in the world, the most perfect meal timing, but if stress is totally out of check or unaddressed, if our sleep quality is poor, or we're not getting enough sleep, if our circadian rhythms are disrupted, all of these things can create a lot of blood sugar wonkiness, regardless of what we're eating.
Comes down to one of my favorite topics, the nervous system.
Yes, it always goes back to the nervous system at the end of
It
the
really
day.
does. That's what I'm like, it just really is all about the nervous system. I mean,
Yep.
it's all about everything, but the nervous system is such a conductor of everything. And the vagus nerve impacts your gut health and the stressors. And it's just all of it really comes down to feeling safe,
Yep,
like
I
you
could
said
not
before.
agree more.
Yeah. So interesting. And so you kind of talked about how like those popular diets can impact it. We discussed about like skipping meals or maybe like going too low on carbs. Are there any other things that you've seen with the more common like, you know, blanket diets?
Yeah, I would say those are two of the biggest ones. So the intermittent fasting, which we see, a lot of women applying as like skipping or delaying breakfast.
Mhm.
And what's tough about these things too is that, there is positive data on, potential metabolic benefits to intermittent fasting in certain
Mhm.
populations, predominantly in men and animal models,
Mm.
that don't take female physiology into account. But newer research is finding that for women of reproductive age, these longer fasts really may be contraindicated. And with these longer fasts, what we're seeing is alterations in the peptide kisspeptin, which is essentially the secretion is altered with these longer fasts where energy carbohydrates are scarce, and kisspeptin influences our gonadotropin releasing hormone, which influences our LH and FSH, which influences our sex hormones and our menstrual cycle. So fasting, interestingly, and I'll be honest, we don't have a ton of data on this. There's, it's definitely newer and there's not a lot of studies in women, but I do also see this in practice in terms of, women that have these really long overnight fasts and, their cycles are irregular, or they're struggling, to conceive. They have really poor stress resilience in their body. So I would
You
say
know what's
the
interesting? I think wait, hold on. Camille, just cut this one part out because there's a little like something. Can you hear me?
yes,
Oh, there's a little
little delay.
I don't know if there's like a connection issue. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello?
Hi, can you hear me?
Okay, perfect. So Camille is my editor. Camille just cut the part out when I'm like trying to figure out what's going on. So what's interesting to me is that, Ayurvedic principles, one of the things that I studied, they talk a lot about how eating during the day when the sun is out, the body's more primed to digest. And uh, and then having like less meals and kind of, if you're going to fast like in the evening time,
Mm-hmm.
and that is when it's more beneficial actually, and it helps
Yep.
your sleep. So it's not that fasting is terrible. It's
Yeah.
just if it's done right, in the right timing, with the right type of body.
Right.
So everybody's also so different. If you have somebody that's way
Yeah.
underweight, they need more reserves, they need more nutrients. So
Yeah.
it wouldn't be beneficial. Somebody who over exercises and really is depleted. So it's like the body has its own bank account. So if you shift it more towards evening, you're kind of working more with that circadian rhythm, because our body's digestive system does slow down as the sun goes down. We
Yep.
really respond to that rhythm. So if we work with our body in that way, because most of us, you can actually, if you go for a long time restricting your diet, you will lose your hunger in the morning. That's what I've seen a lot of times with my patients. And then once you start to do to eat little by little, you'll find that comes back. It's just like thirst. Same thing. Use it, you lose it. Your body
Yep.
sort of like just adapts to whatever you give it. But then your body will need that energy, and you'll feel it, and you'll feel the difference. So on that level, I think that there is something to that circadian rhythm and kind
Yeah.
of working with nature, where it gets more optimized, I believe, if you do want that break in the evenings. Now, another thing that I've heard of a lot is it's not just about eating like certain carbs, it's how you eat the carbs. Because you can first start out with like a protein or some fiber, something first for the body to take that's not going to spike the sugar. And then after that, ease into maybe fruit or something sweet, where your body's able to take that more evenly. Am I correct? I know like my
Yeah.
background's not nutrition, but that's
Yeah.
what I've
Yeah, I'd
understood.
say on both accounts too, with what you're describing in terms of principles in Ayurveda with meal timing. I'm a big advocate of circadian eating, where we're breaking our fast earlier in the morning, eating consistently throughout the day, but then maybe having an earlier dinner. And there's so much nuance depending on the individual and what they have going on. But at the end of the day, context is king. So, fasting at the end of the day, especially if the fast is prolonged, is a stressor on the body, right? So if, we're someone that is, underweight, we have a lot of, life stress going on, and we're thinking about that context. Um, our body, it may not be supportive for our body to have a longer overnight fast. For someone that, stress is lower, they're well fueled, well nourished, their nervous system is supported, they, may benefit from that, longer overnight fast. But I completely agree that, in terms of what you described and kind of the data we're seeing too, where, eating kind of earlier in the day when the body is prepped and primed for fuel has a lot of benefits. And in terms of the blood sugar piece with meal composition, you're spot on when it comes to carbohydrates at the end of the day. There's absolutely, variation in how different carbohydrates are going to impact our blood sugar in terms of how rapidly, our blood sugar will respond in terms of eating different carbohydrate foods. But at the end of the day, really all carbohydrates are broken down quickly and make blood sugar rise more rapidly. So the blood sugar balance from a meal composition standpoint is really going to come from the food pairings, like you mentioned. So the protein, the fiber, the healthy fats, protein in particular is really supportive when it comes to blood sugar. And essentially it with what you're describing in terms of, having some protein, having, the fiber, prioritizing that even first or earlier on in the meal, these things sort of act like a buffer. So it's going to slow down the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream. So instead of the carbohydrates kind of, hitting the body and spiking our blood sugar, it's going to be a much slower, more rapid rise. So those food pairings are really key. And then definitely also thinking about, carb quality. Sometimes I think when we think about carbs, we think about bread and pasta, right? And, when I think about carbohydrates, I'm thinking, in carbohydrates that we want to bring into the diet to really provide like deep nutrition. I think about, our starchy vegetables, our sweet potatoes, our potatoes, our squash. I think about fruit. I think about, legumes. I think about, and not, maybe not everyone is going to do great with legumes. Again, there's a lot of nuance here, but I think about those fiber and nutrient dense starches that, provide ample nutrition for the body alongside these other elements that promote the blood sugar regulation.
Yeah. So basically, juice, even if it's like fresh grape juice, is not great on an empty stomach.
Yes. And I feel like a good, even just like visualizing it, if you imagine like eating a grapefruit and like eating all the, flesh and the time that it takes you and you're chewing and, breaking all that down versus drinking a glass of grapefruit juice, where, there's probably several grapefruits in there. All of the, fleshy fiber is removed and it's just like, liquid sugar.
Straight up.
So yeah.
Right in
Yeah.
sugar IV.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, this is great. I mean, we can keep going on and on, but it's such great information because it really breaks it down. I think a lot of people hear all of these things and they hear about blood sugar, they hear about gut health, they hear about what happens after getting off the birth control pill. But like to break it down, I think is so great because very similar to our journey. A lot of people are going and they're trying to get answers and they're not getting any. So I think that having this information is really what is going to empower a lot of people, just having the information and understanding really like what it means. It's not just
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, gut health is great for my fertility, but what does that mean? And how can, like, what can you do to really impact it?
Right.
Those are really important things for people to know. And I think ultimately, having that knowledge is really what is going to empower people, just like it did us and what got us into the work we're doing. I think
Yep.
that it
Yeah.
inspires you because then you're like, I don't want anybody going through what I went through.
Right. And
Yeah.
and there's so much noise out there, right? There's so much information, which is a blessing and a curse. And
Yep.
I think at
Yeah.
the end of the
100%.
day, like, yeah, at the end of the day, with the things we're talking about too, a lot of these things are not the sexiest or the most exciting things, right? Meal composition and meal timing or, circadian rhythms. And I think it's easy to fall into the trap of like that shiny object syndrome. And it's like, just the different trends out there and fads on social media. And at the end of the
The
day, a lot of
buzzwords.
this,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of this, it's back to the basics, right? And prioritizing those foundations and the nervous system support. All of these things are going to be likely some of the biggest key pieces, on a hormone healing journey, on a fertility journey. So I think it's important to point that out too, because there's a lot out there.
Oh, for sure. No doubt. So for people hearing this and wanting to like learn more about you and your offerings, how can people find you?
Yeah, so you can check out my website, which is just jilliangreaves.com. Lots of information, resources over there about, what we do, how we work with women, recipes, articles. And you can also check me out on Instagram. My handle is just Jillian Greaves RD. I'm always over there sharing nutrition tips, recipes, and talking all things women's health.
Awesome. I love it. Well, I could definitely feel the passion that you have in this, and I can definitely like hear, the knowledge and the research that you've done. So this is amazing, amazing information that you shared, and I had a great conversation with you today, Jillian. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.